Winston County, Mississippi, sits low and green where the pines give way to hardwood bottoms, and on a stretch of highway called Route 393, if you know where to slow down, a rectangular shape rises out of a pasture like something the land decided to keep. It is 25 feet high. It runs 218 feet in one direction and 140 in the other. It has stood there, by the most careful estimate anyone has been willing to make, since somewhere between the years 200 and 600 of the Common Era. No one has ever dug into it. Not once, not in the 2 centuries since American surveyors first wrote its name down, has a single archaeological excavation been carried out on the mound itself. Everything known about its age comes from what has washed up on its surface. The inside of it has never been opened. The Choctaw call it Nanih Waiya, the leaning hill, and for longer than any written record, they have called it something more specific than a monument. They have called it their mother. About 1 mile east, across a line no one drew until the 1800s, there is a second place that belongs to the same story. A natural hill, wooded, unremarkable from the road, holds an opening in its side that leads down into the dark. Locally it is called Nanih Waiya Cave, though some who know it best call it by an older name, Nanih Waiya, the place of growth. In the telling passed down through Choctaw families for generations, this is not a cave that something once used. This is the place where the first people came up out of the ground. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. In the summer of 1973, 2 cave explorers went in with rope and lights to see how far the passage went. They got 137 feet before the ceiling, and the water stopped them. 35 feet in, the floor had already begun to flood, and the flooding only deepened as they went. They came back out having mapped what they could, and having confirmed what generations of Choctaw visitors already knew, without needing a survey. The cave goes down farther than anyone standing at its mouth can see, and at some point, the earth simply will not let you keep walking. What the mound looks like today is not what it once was. Early accounts, going back to the 1850s, describe a low earthen wall and a ditch running around it on 3 sides, enclosing roughly a square mile of ground, along with several smaller mounds nearby. Those smaller mounds are gone now. Decades of ploughing, beginning not long after the Choctaw lost legal control of the site and continuing through much of the 20th century, leveled them into the surrounding fields before anyone thought to record their shape or take a measurement. No photograph of them is known to survive. No excavation was ever attempted. What they were built for, who was buried in them, how many there had originally been, all of it went into the topsoil of Mississippi row crops, and today, the historical record can only say that they existed, because a handful of 19th century visitors happened to write down that they saw them. The main mound survived because its size made it harder to farm through. Even so, an 1854 visitor to the site noted that ploughs had already begun cutting into its edges. What stands today, 25 feet of packed earth still holding its rectangular shape, after roughly 1,400 to 1,700 years, is what was left after everything smaller around it had already been erased by agriculture, one growing season at a time. The written record of what this place meant to the people who built it, or who came to revere it, survives mostly by accident, preserved by outsiders for reasons that had nothing to do with respect. In the 1840s, the United States government convened something called the Choctaw Claims Commission, a body meant to investigate whether American citizens had violated the terms of a treaty the Choctaw had been forced to sign more than a decade earlier. A Mississippi writer named J.F.H. Claiborne later described the testimony he heard from Choctaw witnesses called before that commission. He wrote that more than one of them told the commission they would rather stay on the land forever than leave the mound behind, even after everything else had been taken. The treaty in question was signed at Dancing Rabbit Creek in September of 1830. It stripped the Choctaw Nation of more than 10 million acres east of the Mississippi River, Nanih Waiya included, and set in motion the forced removal that would carry most of the Choctaw people west, into what is now Oklahoma. Roughly 4,000 chose to stay in Mississippi under the treaty's terms, defying enormous pressure to leave. Within 20 years, nearly all of them had lost even the small land allotments the treaty had promised them. But some of those who stayed did so, according to the accounts that survive, because leaving the mound was not something they were willing to do, whatever it cost them. For the next century, the mound passed through private hands. A family named Luke owned it for generations. Plows worked the fields around it. The smaller mounds vanished. The moat and embankment eroded down to a short remaining stretch, the only piece of what had once enclosed a full square mile. And the cave, the place where the Emergence story says the first people climbed up into the light, sat closed off in its hillside, visited quietly by Choctaw families who never stopped treating it as sacred ground, regardless of who held the deed. The story those families kept alive did not come from a single fixed telling. There are, by the accounting of researchers who have collected them, at least two distinct traditions. One describes a long migration from somewhere far to the west, led by a spiritual leader who carried a sacred pole and planted it in the ground each night. The pole leaned toward the east every morning until, at Nanih Waiya, it finally stood upright, and that was understood as the sign to stop traveling and settle the land permanently. The other tradition does not describe a journey at all. It describes creation happening on this spot, the first people rising directly out of the hill. An account recorded from a Choctaw storyteller named Isaac Pistonatubby in 1901 describes the Muskogee coming up out of the ground at Nanih Waiya first, sunning themselves dry on the mound's earthen slope before the other peoples followed. A separate version, gathered by a Mississippi writer named Gideon Lincecum sometime before he left the state in 1848, describes the Choctaws' migration ending at a sloping hill with an opening in its side, overlooking a stream below, matching the cave's position almost exactly. Lincecum recorded no measurements of the hill and no description of how large the opening was. He recorded only that this was where the story said the journey ended. Both traditions agree on one thing. Whatever the origin, human or emergent, the story does not end with people arriving somewhere new. It ends with them recognizing a place that was already waiting for them, a hill with something inside it, and deciding they had found what they had been looking for. The mound and the cave are not, by any archaeological standard, unexplained the way the term gets used elsewhere. Their construction is understood in broad strokes. What is genuinely unresolved is almost everything specific. The dating rests entirely on surface artifacts, never on anything recovered from inside the earthwork, because nothing has ever been recovered from inside it. The full extent of the surrounding village, and how many people lived and were buried there across the centuries the site was in use, is estimated from fragments and early written descriptions rather than from any modern excavation. Archaeologists have found no clear evidence that the later Mississippian culture, the mound-building tradition responsible for sites like Moundville in Alabama, continued using Nanih Waiya after around the year 700. Why activity there seems to have stopped, and what happened at the site in the centuries between that point and the Choctaws' documented presence beginning in the 15 or 1600s, is a gap the written record does not fill. That gap is not a suppressed finding. No agency buried a report, and no researcher was reassigned for asking the wrong question. It is simply a gap, honestly labeled as one by the people who study the site, and it has stayed a gap for one plain reason. Nobody has been permitted or has chosen to dig. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. 1959 brought the first real change in control the site had seen since the treaty. The Luke family sold Nanih Waiya to the Mississippi State Park Commission that year, and for the first time since 1830, the mound was in the hands of an entity whose stated purpose was to preserve it rather than farm around it. The park opened to visitors in 1962. 9 years later, in 1973, the mound and its associated village site were added to the National Register of Historic Places. The same year, the two cave explorers went in with their ropes and lights and came back out, having mapped 137 feet of passage before the water stopped them. It is worth sitting with that coincidence for a moment. The federal government recognized the site's significance the same year two amateur explorers confirmed, for the first time with an actual survey, that the cave beneath the neighboring hill goes deeper than anyone had been able to document. For 33 years after that, Nanih Waiya existed in an odd kind of custody. It belonged to the state of Mississippi, protected under law, open to any visitor willing to drive out to Winston County and walk the fenced perimeter. It did not belong to the Choctaw, the people whose origin story it was, the people whose ancestors had told a federal claims commission in the 1840s that they would not leave it under any circumstance, and yet had lost it anyway. A state park ranger could tell you the mound's dimensions. No Choctaw tribal government held the deed. That changed in 2 steps. In 2006, the Mississippi legislature passed a bill returning ownership of the parkland to the Luke family, the same family that had sold it to the state nearly 50 years earlier. It was not on its face a transfer to the Choctaw at all. It went to private hands first. But in 2008, under the leadership of Tribal Chief Beasley Denson, the Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians acquired the site by purchase, and for the first time in 178 years, the mother mound belonged again to the people whose mother it was said to be. The tribe marked the date. Every August 18th since 2008, the Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians has held Nanih Waiya Day, a tribal holiday built around the return of the site, with traditional foods and dances held on ground that 33 years of state stewardship and 178 years of private ownership before that had never quite managed to make into anyone else's. The cave did not reopen the way the mound did. Today the mound remains visible to the public from the road and can be visited, but the tribe asks that visitors treat it with the respect due sacred ground rather than a roadside attraction. The cave is different. It is closed. Access requires approval from the tribe's own Wildlife and Parks Office, and tours are granted only on request. For a site with no fence around its meaning, only a fence around its entrance, that distinction says something. The mound is a monument the world is allowed to look at. The cave is a threshold the Choctaw have decided, on their own terms this time, who gets to cross. None of this closes the archaeological gap that sits at the center of the place. The dating still rests on surface material. No excavation has been conducted inside the mound, and given the site's status now, none is likely to be. That absence used to be a matter of neglect, decades in which no one thought a native mound in rural Mississippi merited the funding or the permission. Today, it functions differently. The tribe that owns the ground has not asked anyone to dig it up, and a mound that has waited 1,400 years without being opened is, under its current ownership, likely to wait considerably longer. The silence here was not always a choice. Now, increasingly, it is. It is worth placing Nanih Waiya against what is known about the broader world it came from. Its construction dates put it roughly alongside Pinson Mounds in Tennessee and Ingomar Mound elsewhere in Mississippi, part of a woodland period tradition of platform mound building that predates the later Mississippian culture, responsible for far larger complexes like Moundville in central Alabama. Archaeologists have found no strong evidence that Moundville's tradition ever incorporated Nanih Waiya directly, and the site appears to fall quiet in the written and artifact record somewhere around the year 700. What happened at Nanih Waiya between that point and the 16th or 17th century, when the historic Choctaw are documented occupying the region and venerating the mound as ancestral ground, is exactly the kind of interval the existing evidence cannot fill in. Some historians argue the Choctaw people themselves formed relatively late, a confederacy of survivors from the collapse of Mississippian-era chiefdoms like Moundville, coalescing into a distinct nation only after European disease had devastated the region's older population centers. If that is closer to the truth than the direct emergence story, it does not make the mound's sacredness less real. It only means the claim of origin may be less about literal genealogy and more about a people choosing, generations later, to plant themselves in the oldest ground available and call it home. Either way, the mound was there first, waiting, exactly as the migration story says it was. The story is not only Choctaw property in the way some tellings frame it either. Versions of the same emergence account describe the Chickasaw, and in some retellings the Creek, and even the Cherokee, coming up from the same ground before scattering to their own territories. A hill outside Louisville, Mississippi, sits at the root of origin stories claimed, in whole or in part, by several of the great nations of the historic Southeast. That is not a small thing for 25 feet of packed earth in a cattle pasture to be carrying. What remains, in the end, is not a mystery in the sense the word usually gets used. Nobody suppressed a discovery here. No agency classified a report or denied a permit to protect a secret. What happened instead was slower and, in its own way, harder to look at directly. A sacred site was taken by treaty under coercion in 1830. The smaller mounds around it were ploughed into nothing before anyone thought to measure them, and no photograph of what they looked like survives. The land changed hands 3 more times across a century and a half, held by a family, then a state government, then the same family again, before finally landing, in 2008, back with the only people who had never stopped calling it their mother. Nothing was proven wrong. Nothing was proven false. But the ground was walked away from something and back to something else, for 178 years, before it belonged again to the people whose oldest stories say they came out of it. Drive out on Route 393 today, and the mound still rises the same 25 feet it always has, still measures the same 218 by 140, still holds whatever is inside it, exactly as it has held it since before the first Choctaw storyteller ever described a sacred red pole standing upright in the ground. 1 mile east, past the county line, the cave still runs 137 feet back into the dark before the water takes over, exactly as it did in 1973, exactly as it likely did centuries before that. Nobody has gone further in. Nobody, under the site's current ownership, is likely to try. The mound has never been opened, the cave has never been fully mapped, and the ground, whatever it is actually holding, is finally back in the hands of the only people who ever agreed, across every version of the story they tell about it, on what to call it. The most detailed archaeological account of the site comes from a Mississippi archaeology study published in 1999 by researcher Ken Carlton, drawing on the fragments of 19th century description that survive alongside what could still be observed on the ground 2 centuries later. Carlton's overview notes that the cave itself may once have had as many as 4 separate entrances, only one of which remains clearly passable today. What closed the others, whether erosion, collapse, or deliberate sealing at some point in the site's long custody, is not recorded anywhere Carlton could find. The Emergence story carries a detail rarely mentioned outside Choctaw oral tradition itself, and it complicates any tidy reading of the site as pure origin myth. In some tellings, grasshoppers emerged from the cave alongside the first humans, swarming out into the light at the same time the people did. As the story goes, the earliest humans, stepping out onto unfamiliar ground, trampled the mother of the grasshoppers by accident, and in the aftermath, the Great Spirit sealed the opening, trapping whatever remained below. Those left behind, in this version of the account, did not die. They changed. They became the ants that still work the dark passages under the Mississippi soil today. It is not a detail found in the federal nomination paperwork or the state park brochures. It survives because Choctaw families kept telling it long after the state had fenced the land and long after archaeologists had stopped asking. Nothing about it fits neatly into a timeline built from surface artifacts and plow scars. It does not need to. The story was never trying to satisfy that kind of record. Roughly 70 miles to the east, in Kemper County, a different set of Choctaw sites came to light only in the past 2 decades, uncovered not by legend, but by an environmental review tied to a power plant and lignite mine. Ground-penetrating radar surveys there, conducted at the request of both the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma and the Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians, gave archaeologists their first real look beneath the soil at settlements dating to the 1700s, sites that had sat undisturbed and undocumented for 3 centuries simply because no one had ever had a reason to look. Nanih Waiya has never received that kind of scan. No radar has passed over the mound. No one has asked what the ground beneath it might show. It remains, by every account, exactly as it has always been, waiting. A thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.